Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Anup Malani, who's a professor at the University of Chicago Law School and Medical School. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a senior fellow at the Schaeffer Center, and an editor at the Journal of Law and Economics. Welcome, Anup.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to go into details of what's happening in India, especially the second wave and associated difficulties there. But I want to start with a larger question, which is a pandemic. I obviously don't know a lot about pandemic, but if I were given this sort of a mathematical problem, I would have thought that it's very difficult to solve this problem in 200. We have approximately 200 different countries, 8.3 billion people. If we try to solve this in 200 different policies and 200 different segments in an interconnected economy, I would have thought that our chance of success is pretty low. I just want to get your insights on it from a policy perspective.
Are you thinking about India as the context of the world? Because they're
I'm thinking about the world, so it is a worldwide problem, but we seem to have tackled it in, sort of a country by country basis.
So this is an age-old problem with a twist because infections spread across borders. But when I say it's an age-old problem, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, embeds in it, and we teach this when we teach constitutional law, embeds in it a balance between central power and decentralized power. Some powers are vested to the national government in Article 1, and some powers are reserved to the states implicitly by not being included in Article 1. And the idea here is that there are merits to centralized and to decentralized decision-making. With centralized decision-making, it's good for things for problems where we're all in the same boat. When I say we here, I mean the U.S. states. Decentralized is good if you want to achieve one of two things. People have different values or goals in different parts of the country. A country like the United States or a country like India, and certainly the whole globe, different areas have different goals. So that's one benefit of decentralized decision-making. A second benefit of decentralized decision-making is sometimes goes under the banner of laboratories for experiment. And the idea here is sometimes when we face a problem, we don't know the answer, but we want to try out a bunch of different solutions. And so we let a number of decentralized entities, states, try different things, and whichever works the best spreads. Okay?
Yeah.
People copy them. So we think of, classic examples of this, things like California's environmental laws, or we think of certain types of financial regulations coming out of New York and ironically some Midwestern states historically. So those are the three overall goals. There's a central goal when we're all in the same boat, and then two values of decentralization. And as it turns out, COVID hits a little bit of everything. So I think what you were hinting at is, infections spread. So in some sense, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
But at the same time, different parts of the world or different states within different countries want to strike different balances when it comes to stopping the epidemic versus allowing businesses to go. And it's also the case that we didn't actually know how to tackle the epidemic. So I think early on, some people thought testing. I still think testing. Some people thought NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. Those are controversial because they can have side effects. And then later on, there's a question of what is the order in which people should be vaccinated, or how much should you vaccinate? How many doses should you buy? And we also saw over the course of the last year, a lot of people make the argument that many national leaders, and I won't name names, but I'm sure everyone in the audience can figure out their favorite national leader as an example, that didn't do well. So those are arguments for why centralization are problematic, even though this is an infectious disease. If you end up with a bad leader making bad decisions, you're going to multiply those errors if everybody's doing the same thing. So that's an argument for decentralization. So to me, my main takeaway is I pull out from this and I say, in a world where we don't actually know the answers, and I still think that we don't know the full answers to COVID. Some people try to claim we do. I don't think we do. I think I like a decentralized approach. And I understand that there are going to be these externalities where places that do poorly are going to spread the infection to everywhere else. But fortunately, we have something like a vaccine. We have several vaccines that can even protect the places that did the right thing, that vaccinated early, from the spread of COVID from places that didn't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So the thought experiment I was running, Anup, is that in a very connected system, and we have two types of connectivity here. One is travel. We are not in 1918 anymore. So you can have feel-good policies about travel restriction. But if you say, well, the citizens can come back from anywhere in the world to that country X, I would characterize that sort of a feel-good policy. If you completely seclude a country, that's one thing. But if you have sort of ad hoc policies, it is still a fairly connected system from a travel perspective. And the other connectivity we have is the economic connectivity, which is a country cannot shut itself down from the rest of the world. We have global supply chains, we have multinationals that connect all the countries together. So the thought experiment I was running, I know I don't have an answer to this, is that a country by country policy, a decentralized decision-making regime, is it really practical in 2020 anymore? I don't have an answer to that.
So I agree with you. Everything's interconnected. You make a very important point about even if you wanted to close your borders to travelers like tourists, you still need supply chains to operate. So there's going to be some interaction, and it's very hard to prevent contact in that manner. And we haven't even talked about repatriation of your own citizens, which is a challenge.
Yeah.
So I agree there's interconnectivity. Connecting it to what we talked about earlier, I would say there may be an argument for decentralization even in the context where you can't do that. That is to say, you cannot isolate yourself from the world. That's my first point.
Yeah.
Second is I found something very interesting about this, which is I think the thing that confounded people was a profound loss of sovereignty. And I mean profound loss of sovereignty in the following sense. You're a country like New Zealand or you're a country like Australia, you lock off from the world, and those countries can. The problem is that that's not a full solution, because if a vaccine doesn't come, or if a vaccine comes but you can't get adequate supply of it, then you've got to stay fully locked down in an autarkic state until the world solves this problem or you are able to get fully vaccinated, and that's not feasible. Right. And we've seen repeatedly, it's kind of, the analogy I would use is trying to hold your breath underwater. Good, but you got to come up for air at some point. And so you found that societies that locked down very effectively early on, when they did come up for air without being fully vaccinated, they had outbreaks. So you had outbreaks in Taiwan, there are outbreaks in China. And so that's the real concern about locking up. Now, I want to bring this back to a profound loss of sovereignty. What I mean is, once you acknowledge that there's no way to stay fully isolated until everybody's vaccinated, what that means is that your success really depends on the success of other countries in their ability to control the virus or get vaccinated. And so then, if you're New Zealand, if you're Australia, if you're China, if you're Taiwan, to some extent you depend on how well India does, and how well Brazil does. And so you don't have a full control. You don't have as complete control as you'd like over your public's health. The solution to that, by the way, was the vaccine. But again, everybody thought that, first of all, I think everybody agrees that it was a miracle that we did this in a year. We were able to develop vaccines. That is just an amazing testament to human ingenuity. But then, you still have to produce it, and then you have to distribute it. There are three legs to this stool, and those two are taking a long time and will take a long time.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Anup. And so secluded policies, when we talked about this almost a year ago now, when things were not this bad, we had talked a little bit about sort of dynamic policies and optimization. Just going to the extremes may not be optimum. But the other point that you're making in terms of R&D and production, so again, if you were an extraterrestrial given this problem 18 months ago and assigned some probabilities, one would have assigned high probability that something emerging in the U.S. because of the pharmaceutical R&D we have in the U.S. But discovering something is just the first step. What we don't have is distributed production. So it doesn't look like the world is set up to tackle pandemics. And this may not be the last pandemic that we tackle, right? So from an infrastructure perspective, from a manufacturing, production, distribution perspective, what do you think? What do you think we should do looking forward?
I think it's very important that we invest in decentralized global production capacity, just working your way backwards to some extent up to the innovation. So we need a worldwide production capacity. And the reason for that is we've observed shortages. Shortages are partly due to the fact that a lot of countries didn't have foresight. A portion of it is due to the fact that certain critical inputs were under the control of or subject to the obstruction of certain countries. And we also saw a lot of vaccine nationalism get in the way.
Yeah.
And, if you care about the welfare of the entire globe, I think it's important to make it so that at no point do politics, do nationalism, these sorts of things get in the way of being able to solve pandemics. So that's the first thing. Decentralized production capacity spread around the world with redundancies. Number two, I think what's critical, which you have to do in every single country, is that we really have to set up adult vaccination infrastructure that is able to operate quickly and efficiently. We don't have that. A lot of countries have, for example, child vaccination, because that's what we typically give, but they don't have adult vaccination. US and Europe and places like Japan might have adult vaccination because they do flu, but a lot of other places don't. And that's going to be critical going forward, especially because, there's a chance, I think people are beginning to realize maybe there's a chance that we're going to have to repeatedly vaccinate for COVID as the strains evolve. The way that I think about this is, look at 1968 when H3N2 comes along the first time around, it's not as bad as COVID, but it's bad. And then after a while, it becomes clear that we're going to have to vaccinate over and over again. And it took a long time to set up this sort of infrastructure, but now we do it. Every year in the US and Europe, you're getting a new vaccine. I think we may need something like that for COVID, potentially, going forward. And so we'd want to have that infrastructure in place, not just for a one-time vaccination, but for a repeat vaccination across the world. And even if you don't think COVID is the reason to do it or a new pandemic, you really should do it because of mRNA vaccines. they have the potential to solve a whole range of diseases. And we want everybody in the world to be able to enjoy those benefits, not just developed countries. So we need to build this infrastructure. So those are the two things that I would do. Then on the innovation front, let me pause here, but I'd be happy to talk about the innovation front. Should we be happy or satisfied if the innovation is done in developed countries? In developed countries. I don't think so, but let me pause and let you.
That's. I wasn't going in that direction, but I want to get your perspective, Anup. So, what one could ask, why is innovation largely in the developed countries? And from an intellectual property rights perspective, one could argue innovation happens in areas where you have well-defined property rights and well-defined intellectual property rights. And so in some sense, it's a regime policy question. And I think India is a good example of this. India and China both, let me make a statement, and if you disagree with it, we can talk about it. I think both of these countries are very good at taking something and really replicating that, but neither have shown very high levels of innovation, probably because they don't really have very good intellectual property rights regime. What do you think?
So I agree with you. This is an area in which I've written, actually. So I agree with you that intellectual property is critical. I'll make one comment on that specific point and then make a broader comment about medical research. In India, there's this sense that India is good at making generics, and the obstacle to making generics is getting access to the intellectual property rights required. And that means getting access to the intellectual property earlier than, say, patent expiration for a new branded drug. And I think that's fine, but that's a very old school view of what India's capacity is.
Yeah.
If you, for example, think, well, India is producing a lot of the scientists that are starting biotech companies and non-biotech companies in the US and maybe to some extent Europe and certainly in East Asia. There's no reason why they couldn't do it in India. We certainly have the capacity to see to have that innovation occur in India. You have to then start saying, well, maybe we need to shift. Instead of wanting to reduce intellectual property so we can produce what other people create, maybe we ought to think about creating ourselves. And I do believe that there are companies in India ready to do that. And India has the human capital to be an innovator, but it requires a mindset change about who you are. And in the short run, it's going to affect the generics companies to some extent. Although, ironically, it could be the generics that are in the best position to do some of the innovation, as I'll get to in a second.
Yeah, so I don't know, just the mindset change, though, Anup. I think I agree with you that India has a human capital, but I see this as sort of a policy problem, which is if you have a country that doesn't grant intellectual property rights as we imagine in developed countries, you have some tactical benefits, but it's going to come back and bite you. I think that is what happened in some extent to India.
Yeah, I agree with that. But although I think, and again, you may be a more astute observer of this than I am, of the policy dynamic in India. But my takeaway has been, over time, there's been increasing support for intellectual property protection within India, driven by business. As they've come to become aware that they are capable of innovating and have their own ideas that they want to protect against foreign copy cats. But the thing that slows it is that IP is not a popular campaign slogan. There's populist opposition, and in particular, India has a kind of leftist populist bent. That is particularly opposed to property rights generally, whether it's intellectual or any other. And I believe that that's a huge obstacle to India's economic growth, including in medical R&D. But that's why I say that I view this as to some extent as a mindset. We really need to if the Indian population and thus Indian politicians viewed Indians as taking pride in their economic success, I think that sort of mindset change would help shift the dialogue. So it wasn't the kind of leftist populist, but more economically nationalist. I don't want to use the word nationalist, but economically proud.
Right.
Then I think you could see IP laws that are stricter, and you turn out Indian wealth would rise.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So to some extent, Anup, it's happening to the U.S. too. So the latest symptom of this is U.S. politicians saying the patents for the vaccines should be essentially invalidated, where Germany and others objected to it. And the simple question there is, if Pfizer invested $500 million of shareholder capital into making an at-risk product, and post development, you say, well, we are in a bad state, let's just invalidate it. Who's going to do it next time?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I found it disconcerting that the U.S. took its most successful response to the pandemic and then vilified it. And if I'm hoping that this is just kind of one of those temporary appease your base type moves that we occasionally see by administrations, but doesn't become serious. Because if it becomes serious, I think the next pandemic, we're going to be the new EU, and Germany or Japan or some other country will be the next US. They will have created the vaccine. They will have made advanced purchase commitments so that there's production capacity built out. They will be the first to vaccinate their populations, and companies will be reticent to do this in the United States because the United States is willing to trade away their patent rights. It's also going to be sad because we'll see the consequence of this beyond COVID or other pandemics. We need to really double down on mRNA to solve a range of diseases, potentially HIV, faster flu vaccines. Left and right, you can see examples of use. The amount of excitement I see among medical researchers is palpable, but you won't see that if we begin to take seriously this limitation of patents. I know everybody likes to rag on drug companies, but drug companies really performed in this pandemic, and I think there's an argument to be made that, like, if we look at medical price inflation, drugs are not the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, drug. This is another misperception, but that would be on a tangent. The pharmaceutical cost of the $4 trillion that we are spending, it's 5 to 7%.
Yeah.
And if you can avoid a hospital stay by taking a pill at home, it's significant economic benefit to society. But I want to go to India. So I know that you have been doing a lot of work in India. I don't want to get any political here, I know, but do you think the government of India has done a good job?
Gill, it's a very good question. And I want to see if it's possible for me to do two things. The first is return to a question that you asked earlier that we incompletely answered, which is on medical R&D. And second is buy myself some time to answer that question in the most politic way possible. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so there's one other thing I wanted to mention about medical R&D. So most people think medical R&D is mainly about coming up with a new molecule, or in this context, a new vaccine. That's a new technology. It's not a molecule, but using mRNA technology to devise a new vaccine. And you do that in the lab, and then you're mainly done. And if that were so, we would have done the vaccine, within a few days. We would have had this vaccine in April, May. But the reality is, we need to do clinical testing. We need to test this in humans. And so and that's a big driver of costs, both because trials are directly expensive, but also because trials take a long time. So you lose a lot of time value of money. Okay, so I roughly think that half of the cost is in each of those, maybe a little bit more for the clinical testing. Mm-hmm. But the type of technology you need for these differs. So when we think about medical R&D and we say which countries can do it, we typically think about that first portion, who can do the lab science. Yeah. The lab science, we think, it gets done in the US or done in Europe or Japan. They've got faster, they've got a better scientists or better scientific establishment. That's true, but that's changing and changing quickly. But that's still substantially true. But the second part of that, clinical testing, there's no reason why it can't be done anywhere in the world. You could have tested COVID patients in India, Brazil, South Africa, China, the United States, anywhere those clinical trials could have been done. And some of them were actually done in multiple places. And that's a place where India, even if it didn't have a great scientific establishment, and it has a reasonably good scientific establishment, to be clear, can compete in. But what's very interesting is that countries have, just in that clinical trial component, have done two things. On the one hand, countries that could be producing clinical trial data, like India and the like, strangely try to limit the amount of clinical trials on the population for nationalist reasons. They say, we don't want foreign drug companies coming in doing this clinical testing. Yeah. But by doing so, they're actually stopping their own production of R&D. Instead, what they should say is, look, we have a population that's capable of producing clinical trial data. That's a form of innovation. Let's specialize in this and figure out how do we protect our population at the same time produce a lot of clinical trials and very quickly. Okay. Yeah. And so India shut itself off, and other countries do this too for I think, ethical reasons that aren't thinking about production of R&D. Then the other thing that happens is that you have not just export restrictions by countries like India, you have import restrictions by the United States, where we say, look, if you want to get approval for a COVID vaccine, you got to do the trials in the US. We won't accept even the UK data. And again, that's really hard to explain. You want to be able to get this R&D done as quickly as possible. Nobody sits there and says, I don't want the iPhone because the parts are produced in China. I just want the iPhone. So if you want a vaccine, you should be okay if part of the R&D is done abroad in the form of clinical trials. And the reality is humans are very, very similar, more similar than they are different. And so for most things, it really doesn't matter that it was done abroad.
I have a sort of an instinctual reaction to it, Anup. I just want to get your perspective on this. So I have no conflicts of interest, even though I worked at Pfizer a long time ago. And one of the reasons the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA require some of this data to be created in the US is that we have had horrible experiences outside the US from clinical trials data. And so it's more of a risk management instinct rather than a policy issue. And so the question will be, how do we sort of, minimize this? You're absolutely right. I mean, we have 1.4 billion people in India. And if you really think about clinical trials design, you have a higher chance of finding a population who are less susceptible to previous chemicals, previous exposure that might feed into the clinical trials data in India, right? And so you have a population that is really good for a clinical trials perspective. But two factors compete there. One is, as you say, sort of the Indian government's policy, which is, the Westerners are testing stuff on us, and we don't want that. That is sort of ignorance that could be changed. And from a Western perspective, I think we are attaching too much importance to previous bad experiences. So we have to get over that too. So two things have to come together.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually think that while there is legitimate concern about the quality of clinical trial data that comes from foreign clinical trials, um, we make too much of it. For example, we were reticent to accept UK data for US approval. That's silly. They have relatively good, maybe higher quality in some cases, clinical trials. And then B, if that's the strategy you're going to take, you're never going to invest to make the foreign trials in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America better. You need to go through some period of learning. And it could be what you say is that the value of those data is a little bit lower, but we like it and we want you to meet certain standards. And we do this for generic production. The FDA goes out and sends manufacturing inspectors to generic plants around the world. Maybe they should do it more, but they do that. And you could imagine the same sort of infrastructure gets developed by the FDA to check to make sure that CROs, clinical trial organizations, or research organizations, are doing a good job in their clinical trials, no matter where in the world they're running.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Anup. There's a bit of an academic bias here too, I think. Because most of the R&D in life sciences, well, I shouldn't say most, but a very high percentage of it is done in the US. I think academic institutions sort of, take the easy way out from experimentation, from proving a hypothesis. But as you say, I think in the long run, that's going to come back and bite us. And this pandemic is a good example of that.
Yeah, I think what you just said is spot on and a bit subversive, so I like it. Interestingly, academia is both the source of arguments for undermining intellectual property, yet it's the same sort of desire for academic credit that leads us to not want to have the research done abroad where we might not get the credit for it. So I do think that we need to globalize this sort of stuff. I'm actually optimistic about all this. I do believe that we'll have some small fights about COVID, but I believe in the long run we'll begin to see the value of having global research, global supply chains, global distribution. I'm just generally optimistic that this is a crisis that we will learn from, although it won't seem like it until we encounter the next one.
Yeah, so I want to also ask you quickly about the WHO. So from my perspective, I know I haven't really studied it, obviously, and you have done a lot of work in this area. From my perspective, it seems like we are lacking a global organization to tackle a pandemic, a global organization that has the resources, the power, the accountability. It is truly a global problem. Do you agree with that? Do you think WHO is the right agency?
So one is I do believe it's a global problem. Second, I do not think that one single entity is the right approach to this problem. And the arguments for that I already gave when we talked about centralization versus decentralization.
Yeah.
If the WHO made the wrong decision, just imagine if it did what the US did at the beginning, right? It initially says masks are not a good idea. You would have a worldwide problem. And you don't want that. You want to have at least 2 or 3 different global organizations thinking about it. Independently. I want them to independently look at the data and see what they get. The third thing to remember about these international organizations is we have 200 governments in the world today.
Right.
And they have sovereignty. There is no world government. And because of that, the WHO relies on the cooperation of each country to be able to get information from that country. I'm not naming names anymore, but if there's a country that has data that you need, unless you make them happy, you might not get that data.
Right.
Which means that you may not be able to critique that country. You may not be able to announce a policy that is contrary to the interest of that country. And so that's going to fundamentally compromise you. And that is not a fault of the international organization.
Yeah.
It is a function of the world we live in. We have 200 nation states. And for, when it generally comes to running the world, that doesn't seem like a bad system, actually. We've gotten quite far with a series of nation states, but this is one of the costs of having nation states. So I wouldn't blame the WHO. It is in a bind. The only other thing that I would add to this is that I worry that the WHO is too much of a public health organization. And that's not the right way to deal with a public health problem, because a public health problem involves people. And to understand people, you need to do more than understand diseases. You need to understand how humans behave. And public health folks are not particularly good at understanding, at least this is my personal opinion. They haven't been great about understanding how humans behave. There's this tendency to believe that humans can't handle complicated information. They need to be told what to do. They need to be given the message. Like it goes back to this old Jack Nicholson line, you can't handle the truth. They sometimes act like that, and that's really problematic. And you've seen this in a few different public health crises, and they've been given warnings. And this is not just one monolith. So a number of folks in the internet, even in the public health community, are given this warning that says, look, if we keep on treating the population as not very smart as children, and we mislead them because we think it's in their interest for them to be misled, once they figure it out, they're not going to trust you. And right now, I think public health faces a problem of trust. Now, for the WHO, what that means is going forward, to work as a public health organization, they need to be a little bit more sophisticated about human behavior. And that requires them to become a social science organization as well as a public health organization. I think it's something that can be done, but we should have, a few of these organizations like WHO and ones that are multidisciplinary.
Yeah, I agree. My naive perspective, Anup, is that we are not really organized to tackle systemic problems to the planet. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a pandemic. Suppose we say there's an asteroid hit in Taiwan, and you say, well, that's Taiwan's problem. We won't be able to tackle it, right? So it seems like we are lacking some basic defense mechanisms against systemic problems on the planet.
Mm-hmm. I agree. But here's the thing. Humans are not computers. It's not even a single computer, to be quite honest. A single human isn't. An individual learns through experience, trial and error. And then if you compound that by saying there's going to be millions and billions of humans, maybe organized into groups, you're going to have a very strange type of trial and error system. But in general, it's pushed us forward in the world. We've seen tremendous progress worldwide. Maybe we've gotten lucky, but maybe it's because we are capable of moving forward. So yes, I believe that it would be nice to have a single omniscient person or computer that can solve everything. We don't have that, but our fallback is us. Right. I think we'll do okay.
Yeah, I agree. We'll take a quick break, Anu. When we come back, I want to dig a little deeper into the second wave that's happening in India.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So Anup, we are back. We were talking about the pandemic and the world's response to it, variety of policy choices. Sometimes it's difficult to handle things in segments as we appear to have done in this time around. I want to talk a little bit more about, or deeper about what's happening in India. I know that your team has done a lot of work in India. About a year ago, we talked about sort of the healthcare systems, insurance policies, and things like that in India. They all have become relevant in the last 12 months, more than we thought when we were talking about it. So we have the second wave. So the first thing I want to ask you, when I analyze these numbers, there appears to be some problems with it. So the latest thing that I saw was about 35 million cases and a mortality rate, case mortality at about 1.2%. That is significantly lower than Western mortality of 1.8 or 1.9% case mortality. And you have done some work in Bangalore and Karnataka state, and I remember you saying that those numbers may be significantly underestimated. So, what's our latest understanding of this?
Okay, so that's a great question. You're asking, I think, about the infection fatality rate, although you said the case fatality rate.
No, I meant the case because infection. Maybe I don't understand this. So, case fatality rate is people died divided by the number of cases we know, right?
Yeah.
Whereas infection fatality rate is people died divided by people who got infected. But the denominator of that, we don't really know, do we?
Correct. So the way that I think about this is I think about a fraction. The fraction, the numerator is the number of deaths, and the denominator. Let's start out by studying the case fatality rate. The denominator would be the number of known cases. Now, the problem with that is that if you don't test very much, your denominator is going to be small. Not because the number of cases is small, but because you're not testing very much. Okay?
Right.
Or you might test a lot, but have a bias towards only testing a certain type of people. Okay, the ones that are getting sick or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's going to be an important thing that leads us to, or leads me to the conclusion that the case fatality rate is not very informative because it really depends on your testing policy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And it's very hard to compare across countries. So if you have one country that does more systematic testing that includes people that are asymptomatic and not asymptomatic, maybe they do more contact tracing rather than just testing at the hospital. And then you have another country that only tests people at the hospital. They could both have the same kind of number of deaths per actual cases that are severe, but they're going to get totally different CFR estimates, case fatality rate estimates, when they look at their statistics. And so I find that until you have a common testing policy, I have trouble comparing the case fatality rate. Now, people try to respond and they say, hold on a second. How about if I just look at the folks that show up at the hospital? How many hospital admissions do I have from COVID in the denominator? That is better. But the difficulty even with that is the following. Different countries, and including different states within India, have different hospital capacity levels per capita.
Right.
And so the threshold for setting somebody in varies. Even worse, in the middle of the height of the first or second wave, you had problems where hospitals were overwhelmed. And that meant that the threshold for admitting you went up. You had to have a more severe case before you could be admitted, in, like, say, ICUs. And so we were holding the denominator to some extent constant, even though the number of cases were multiplying, actual cases were multiplying. And in that context, you're going to get the wrong answer on CFR. So that's why I've tried to stay away from CFR discussions to the extent possible. I know doctors and physicians, they like it because that's something they see often, but their implicit assumption is they've diagnosed everything.
Right.
They also like it because it's what they see in the hospital. They're not roaming around the community doing tests on even asymptomatic people.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's why I think CFR was the thing that people looked to initially, doctors looked to. I don't think it's a very useful thing. I think.
So this makes a lot of sense to me, Anup. So I've been struggling with. So I grew up in southern state of India called Kerala, and my parents still live there, so I talk to them quite often. And I was looking at the case fatality rate. Kerala against say Andhra Pradesh or Maharashtra or Karnataka. It appears to be 1/3 compared to those states. And I was hoping for some sort of a medical explanation, but the explanation might be that Kerala has a higher denominator because of better testing.
Yeah. If you want to drive down your CFR, test more. And maybe that's a good incentive, but it's not giving you medically useful information.
Yeah. So the IFR, the infection fatality rate, how do we get to that? So before we go into the details of that, so this idea of the second wave that appeared to be 10 times the intensity of the first wave. What's our current hypothesis? I'm talking about India specifically. What's our current hypothesis why that happened?
So, in my analysis of the second wave, I've come to two conclusions, and this is and I will tell you this is not because I've done extensive sequencing and I've been on the ground. This is through deduction, kind of forensic statistics, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think there are causes. Number one, after the first wave, there was still a large population that remained susceptible, that wasn't infected. And I think that you can isolate these groups. They have certain characteristics. So the first wave mostly struck individuals in cities more than rural areas, although not a big difference between the two. Serological tests suggest that they're only 10 percentage points higher seroprevalence in cities than rural areas, but it was higher. So cities were hit more. And then within cities, you can see that poorer communities were hit far, far more. And this we've seen in serological studies that I've worked on, the most notable one being Mumbai, where we saw seroprevalence, antibody prevalence in 55% of slum residents, but only 15% of non-slum residents. So you basically see poor individuals in cities being hit the hardest. Okay. Now, the remainder of the population was much more unaffected, much more likely to be susceptible. And so when the second wave came along, they were the ones to be infected. That's explanation number one, and I'll give you some evidence supporting that in a second. The second piece of information is that if you look at the height, the height of the second wave versus the first wave, I don't think the difference is that the first wave infected fewer people. I think that if you look at the first wave, it rose more slowly and declined more slowly relative to the first to the second wave. The second wave skyrocketed. It was like a rocket ship.
Right.
And I don't know if more people are infected. It could be about the same, but certainly the amplitude was much bigger in the second.
It's an area under the curve that we need to compare. Yeah.
Exactly. And we don't know that yet because the second wave's not over completely. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's about the same. Now, you cannot. It's very hard to explain why it rose that much more quickly. In fact, before we looked at the second wave, before you put that on a graph, the first wave looks pretty ominous. It only looks mild once you put the second wave on there, and then all of a sudden you see the second wave is much higher, shorter lived.
Right.
You have to ask yourself, well, how come it spread more quickly, even though the population had more immunity already, or at least a portion did? Yeah. And I think the answer has to be the new variants. And so I think that the 1-2 punch is the following. You had the 617 variants coming out of India that were more transmissible, perhaps 60% more transmissible than the original variants.
This is a Delta variant, as I said?
Yes, yes. And then they're 60%, potentially up to 60% more transmissible. And you had a large pocket of susceptibles. And so you can see this very sharp rise when you have the greater transmissibility with the new variants. And then if you go look and talk to people, who are the people that were infected in the second wave, they were higher income individuals. So you saw, for example, a notable statistic coming out of Mumbai that people talk about is that 90% of the cases were in non-slums. And that gives you a sense of what was going on. Basically, the high-income populations were more likely to be socially distanced, practicing masking, etc. That was great. They survived the first wave, but then when the second wave came along, even they weren't secure. It could be that they relaxed their behavior a little bit over time, but then they got hit pretty hard. And it's an unpopular thing to say, but I think one of the reasons why, I'm going to give you two indirect pieces of evidence suggesting that high-income individuals are hit by the second wave more than the first wave. And again, this is all indirect. The first is you heard about it in the American press much more quickly, right? The first wave you heard about, but you didn't hear about a lot. And I think part of that reason is because low-income individuals in India don't have a lot of voice. They're not talking to the New York Times. Whereas if you take high-income individuals, they are talking to the New York Times. They have relatives in the United States that are also probably going to be high income, and those individuals are professional, and many of them are going to be journalists or no journalists. They had much quicker voice. So that's one. The second thing is that when we were looking at economic data, looking at data on incomes from the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, we noticed something very interesting. Incomes for all income quartiles fell during lockdown. Okay?
Yeah.
But interestingly, those that came from the highest income households, the highest quartile income households, those individuals didn't return to work after the lockdown as quickly as low-income individuals did. Let me restate that. High-income individuals stayed away from work for longer than low-income individuals did.
Yeah.
And what that could signal is, and it was very interesting because it suggests that if anything, the lockdown had a kind of a progressive effect because it actually reduced the income inequality that we saw, but it also, relevant to the second wave, indicated that people stayed away from each other a little bit more. Otherwise, they would earn the higher income, or their income would return. So that was the other piece of data I had that suggests to me that the composition of who is infected in this wave is different than in the first wave. So it's a combination of pocket of susceptibles, and in this case, high income, and new variants that drove the second wave.
Yeah, so my mind is spinning, I know. So I want to go back to sort of the first thing, which is, so we see a differential in antibody tests between the slums of Mumbai and the suburbs of Mumbai, let's call it 55 to 15 in the first wave. Now, that could be due to two things, right? It could be due to the fact that COVID-19 spread in the slums a lot faster and then created antibodies. It could also be due to the fact that maybe in the slums they have had previous infections that gave them the antibodies. Do we have any sense of why that's the case?
Yeah, so that's a reasonable hypothesis. The Mumbai study, when it was originally published, actually, one could make the argument that it had this weakness. The study used a CLIA test that targeted the nucleocapsid, in the virus. And again, this is getting kind of deep into the testing, but there are two potential targets that you can search for when you look for antibodies. You could look for the nucleocapsid or the spike protein. Okay. Now, we generally like to look for the spike protein because there's this sense that the SARS-CoV-2, that its spike is different than other coronaviruses, whereas its nucleocapsid is not as different. Yeah. And what that means is that if you do a test for nucleocapsid, maybe what you're picking up is antibodies to the prior coronaviruses, that are endemic to India. Yeah. Now, there are two responses to that. Three, actually. The first one is the tests on which the lab studies that were done to validate these tests suggest that they are still specific. That is to say, the CLIA for nucleocapsid is still specific, and the way they do that is they check to see if it turns on, generates false positives when you have negative samples. Okay, so presumably some of those negative samples might have previously been infected with other coronaviruses, and they didn't light up the test. So that's the first argument. The lab test suggests that it's specific. A second argument is the following. Even if it was not specific, the only way it would go off is if that individual happened to have a non-COVID coronavirus recently, and so their antibodies were in their system.
Yeah.
And that's not obviously going to be the case because we know, and we know this in coronaviruses, that antibodies, once you clear an infection, an antibody leaves the system. And so the probability that they were infected with a non-COVID coronavirus just, in the last few months before our tests is low. They might have been infected in the year before or 5 years before, but then we wouldn't have seen the antibodies.
So there's a sort of timing effect. I don't know anything about this, Anup. So the T cell defense, I understood that as more long term, but that is not the case here.
No. I want to separate out three things.
Yeah.
So first is you can test to see if the virus is in your body. That's RT-PCR, for example, tests. The second thing you can do is test to see if you've got an antibody response. So we call these serological tests, but they're tests to see antibody prevalence. Antibodies, depending on the type, don't stay in your system for a long period of time. They show up to be able to battle the virus when you get it, and then once you're done, your body wins, over time the antibodies get cleared. They're proteins, they're costly to produce. Your body doesn't need a lot of antibodies floating around. They're broken down and they go away. And there's a debate, a discussion about how long it takes for them to clear. Some people say as short as 3 months, some people say as long as a year, but they do clear. And then after they clear, you still have immunity. This is something that people misperceive. They think, and not you, but I've heard this in popular discussions. Hey, if I don't have antibodies, do I no longer have immunity? The answer is no, because your body, after it clears the antibodies, memorizes which antibodies it needs to be able to counter the infection. And it does that through something called cellular immunity, in particular T cells and B cells. They memorize what antibodies to be produced when they see this particular virus, and they just keep a memory of it, but you don't have the antibodies in your blood. So that's cellular immunity. That can last a very long time, but that too over time will go away, as it's not efficient for your body to remember very, very old viruses that don't keep coming back. It's just a waste of memory in some sense.
So the T cell memory is sort of a heuristic, a template for manufacturing of a defense of an antibody, whereas the antibodies themselves are chemicals that get cleared. So you have some sort of a heuristic developed in the body. So going back to the Mumbai observation, so it seems like we have clear evidence that the high antibodies that we measured there is related to recent infections, if not COVID.
Yes, it is related to recent infection. I would argue that it's probably COVID. There was one more argument I wanted to make for why it's COVID. We took a random subsample of the blood samples, and we did another round of testing, but we did it with both ELISA and neutralizing antibodies. So our ELISA test was checking for antibodies to the spike protein, and our neutralizing antibodies were doing the same, and were even stronger tests. And those generally validate the results that we found in the first round, which is to say in the first round of tests, which is higher rates of antibodies, higher seroprevalence among slums than in non-slums. So that is the case. But now I want to get back to your question, but if you don't mind, I'll ask you to repeat it.
No. So I was just, no. So I get that now. So I was going back to, it's a country based on a class system. If I understand this data, it seems to me that the poor and and those with low connections, maybe the inability to stay away, got the first wave, and the opposite of that did not get the first wave. And then it seems like it's reversing now, because those who got the first wave got immunity, and now the second wave is affecting those who escaped the first one. Is that the way to think about it?
It is, and an interesting way to think about it even further, although exactly what you said is exactly right. And another way to think about it is everybody that was infected in the first wave got their first dose of vaccine. And the people that were not infected in the first wave, those guys were susceptible. It's like they were unvaccinated. And so when you entered the second wave, when it started, I automatically, my first thought was immunity is doing some work here. Because if immunity wasn't working, if you didn't have some degree of at least medium-term protection, you would find the same level, the same incidence that you did the first time. You would have found that low-income individuals in urban settings would have been a lot of the cases, in part because they live in such crowded conditions. In slums, you're sharing toilets and water taps and things like that. All the things that cause infection to spread generally cause COVID to spread. The fact that those individuals weren't dominating the cases tells me that natural immunity helps. And to the extent that vaccine acquired immunity mimics natural immunity, that's a good sign.
Yeah. This is not a political statement, but just mathematically, it appears that the waves are creeping up in some sense of the class system. So do you see a third wave that might affect sort of the super class or super rich?
That's a very interesting question. I've heard two hypotheses. One is what you just said, and then the other one is the children are going to be affected. And the short answer is I don't know. But we can find out the answer very easily. And the way to find out the answer very easily is to do serological testing.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a complete answer, but one, if you're at war, and here we're at war, my friend Alex Tabarrok likes to use this analogy. We should think of us as waging a war against the virus. If we were waging a war, an ordinary, guns war, we would certainly want to get intelligence, right? Where is the enemy coming from, and what are weak points in defense? We should be doing the same thing with testing, and surprisingly, we're not. Even to this day, we should be doing population-level serological testing repeatedly, every 2 weeks, every month, around the country, and it's very, very cheap to do. India has the lab capacity to do it, and we should be doing it. That would be able to answer the question you just asked. I would look for two things. A, are the super wealthy still susceptible? And I don't mean like the billionaires. I just mean people even further up the income.
Yeah, I mean that is still 50 million. I know.
Yes, exactly. And then the second thing is I would look to see if children are still susceptible by seeing if they've got antibodies. I can see why people are worried because they weren't affected in the first wave. They've been kept out of school. Maybe they haven't gotten infected. But look, we can figure it out. And the reason we should figure it out is we'll figure out if we need to protect these individuals. We'll learn a little bit about how the virus works. And more importantly, a ton rides on the decision about children. If we think that children are vulnerable, I think you'll see movements to keep schools closed for another year. Whereas if they're not vulnerable, schools will be open. And if we act out of too much precaution, we might keep them closed for no good reason. And that would have very big long-term economic and importantly health consequences because education is a big driver of both your long-term welfare and your health.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Anup, I have two questions for you. So from a policy perspective, what would you recommend for India today? And you talked about testing. Testing is certainly something that they have to do more of. But more broadly, what would you do today? And I think this is, at least from my perspective, this is a first iteration. So what would you say a country like India should do when COVID 2025 come along? So two questions.
Okay, so I want to separate out near term what we should do for any future waves of COVID versus COVID 2025, which I think of as the next pandemic. I'll try to address them in order.
Yeah.
The first thing is we should figure out who remains susceptible. That requires serological testing, as I said. I was hoping that by now serological testing would become so normal I could instead tell you about how we need to improve serological testing, but we need to do that as well. So it's not enough to do what we've been doing so far, which is just see what population level seroprevalence surveys say. But we need to be able to adjust these studies to account for the fact that antibodies decay over time. And that requires us to go back to people who tested positive over the last 9 months and see how much their antibodies decayed. So that's the first thing, a serological survey that also accounts for antibody decay.
Yeah.
Number two, we need to figure out what's happening with with these variants. I believe that we should, it doesn't require a lot, but we should every week take 100 or 1,000 samples across the country that are positive, geographically dispersed, sequence them, and make that data available for everybody to analyze. The people that analyze this are not just in India, but around the world, and we need to make people aware of what's going on. Not just to find new variants. What we're really interested in beyond finding new variants is learning how fast this virus is moving through genetic space, because that tells us how far the next variant is going to be from the original variants, and thus how much cross-reactivity you're going to get, how much protection you're going to get from the new variant from having immunity to the old variant. The bigger that distance is, the less protection you'll get. So we need to know that. That's number 2 that I would do. Again, very easily to do. India has the capacity to it. It just requires a will. Number 3, I believe that India needs to set up its vaccination system. It not only needs to vaccinate now as fast as possible, but it needs to set up a non-temporary adult vaccination system so it can go back out into the field. If we find out in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years that this thing has really evolved so we don't have cross-reactivity, we're going to need to give other rounds of vaccine. And the reality is it's going to be much more quickly to develop mRNA vaccines than typical vaccines, inactivated or other methods. And so we're going to have to build a cold chain. One of the best pieces of news we got recently was that, for example, Pfizer's doses don't need to be kept at as low a temperature. You don't need minus 80. What that means is that it may become feasible for us in India to have a full distribution network with regular refrigerators that can handle mRNA vaccines potentially.
Oh, that'll make a big difference, yeah.
A huge difference. And so we should do that. We should plan to be building out that infrastructure today. It's great because that can be a backbone to better healthcare infrastructure generally, but we should do that. And then the 4th thing I think we need to do is I think we need to get better data systems and more transparent data systems so that local actors can make better judgments about NPIs. I don't believe that a national lockdown is the answer. I think targeted lockdowns are the answer, if anything. It's not clear that that's enough, but targeted lockdowns is what we should practice because they have big side effects. To do that, we have to make intelligent decisions and only do it where it's necessary. I think that's the other thing I would do is develop that data system, the transparency, and a methodology for targeted lockdowns. We have great groups who are working in India. Sandeep Janeja is a great example that comes to mind, but there are many others that are thinking about, and we're doing this too, and have been for the last year, thinking about targeted lockdowns and understanding how they affect human behavior and the spread of infection. We should get better at that going forward.
Yeah, so we have learned a lot from this. So if we look forward, though, and I'm thinking about the United Nations perspective. I keep thinking that do we really have an organization, a system that can, intervene in a systemic discontinuity for the world? And it doesn't seem like, we have the Security Council. They're still counting the ICBMs. I think we have moved quite a bit from that. So do we have sort of an archaic United Nations, you think?
I do, but I don't think that there's an immediate solution. This is not you used to have a League of Nations, it didn't work well, you could replace it with the UN. The UN is a series of organizations that handles a lot of international issues ranging from migration to food and agriculture to human rights to refugee camps to COVID, right? WHO is a little different, and that's fine. I think that's a good model. The thing that I worry about is these are entities that don't have a lot of legitimacy in a lot of national governments.
Yeah.
And they don't have, they have their own problems because they don't have the right incentives sometimes to do the right things, but that are critically necessary because you need to have coordination. So I would encourage these organizations. Again, I like the idea of multiple international organizations that are dealing with COVID so that none can be particularly captured or beholden and they think independently. Yeah. But it's also very important to remember the following. There is a small, take an epidemic like COVID. If you worked in this world, it wouldn't take a long time to figure out who the big movers and shakers are, and they all know each other. Yeah. And that's great because when they know each other, they can get international cooperation very quickly. They can get on the same page. But the flip side of that is you're not going to get a lot of accountability because nobody wants to say, hey, that person could have acted quicker on NPIs, or that person should have said something else on masks. And so there's a pro and a con to having this small community that runs the international organizations. Mm-hmm. And we really need to think about governance of those organizations if we want them to have legitimacy and accountability.
Yeah, and resources and accountability. I think, if one country is in a position to pull the rug out of an organization, at the height of a crisis, that's a big problem.
Correct. And I hadn't mentioned that, but that is a very important one. If there's a country that offers a lot of the money, they're going to be able to dictate terms, and they're going to the organization's going to feel like they can't contravene that country. And to be even more realpolitik about it, there are some countries that are more willing to use that power than other countries.
Yeah.
And the countries that are more willing to use that power are the ones that get the most out of that power, because the international organization knows, no amount of pushback is going to change their mind. Whereas you take a country like the United States, when it tries to push an international organization, there is a press there that is more than willing to talk about how a particular administration or politician played unfairly with the WHO. So in that sense, we have to understand that some places are going to get a lot more attention than others, but that's not always the best indicator of where you have good behavior or bad behavior.
Yeah, we need some game theory frameworks here, Anup.
Yes.
So this has been great, Anup. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.